Welcome to the 2026 series of Psychoanalytic Conversations. I'm Pani Madubela, an Executive Director of the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis. The intention of this series of webinars is to stimulate thoughtful discussions of topics that are of significant human interest, yet topics that are often not engaged by psychoanalytic organizations, whose focus is exclusively that of clinical theory and practice. If you have ideas for future topics that the Institute might address, please contact us at our email address, info@rediscoveringpsychoanalysis.org. We hope you enjoy and feel educational benefit from this webinar. Thank you.
Welcome to the third in this 2026 series of Psychoanalytic Conversations, sponsored by the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis. This webinar presents a conversation under a very intriguing and perhaps enigmatic title: Dignity, Evil, and Love. What three more important terms could one think of could there possibly be, especially in these perilous times? Now, I'm going to introduce tonight's conversationalists. We were to have been chaired by Professor Darlene Miller, who had extenuating circumstances and is not able to be with us. We were also going to be chaired by Ms. Taboho Locke, who stepped in at the last minute, and she has turned out to have technical difficulties. I'm Barnaby Barrett, so I'm going to do a dual function, perilously do a dual function, as both chair of the discussion and a participant. So I want to introduce tonight's conversationalists. Now, our main speaker, who is on the screen in front of you, who inspired this webinar's topic, is Professor Lewis R. Gordon. He is in my experience of him over the past couple of years, he is an utterly delightful man, a true mensch, and a really brilliant scholar and intellect. He's the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Global Affairs, as well as head of the Philosophy Department at the University of Connecticut. He's also honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies and distinguished scholar at the Patterson Center for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies. He's the author of many, many books, including perhaps most recently Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization in 2021, but also Fear of Black Consciousness, which came out in 2022, and which I was absolutely delighted to first encounter in an airport bookstore, which gives one hope, I think, for the future. He is also author of Black Existentialism and Decolonizing Knowledge. He is also author of Not Bad for an N, Pas Mal pour un N, N'est-ce pas? The 30th anniversary edition of his first book, Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, features a foreword by Mahobo P. Moore and afterwards by Jacqueline Martinez and Paget Henry. The year 2025 also marks the 30th anniversary of his second book, Fanon and the Crisis of European Men. Gordon Lewis is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. And I also want to mention that he and I did a podcast previously, which appears on the website of the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis, in which we really tried to get to grips with the question whether bringing psychoanalysis as a discipline to the global South might simply be a neocolonialist project. This is available on the Institute's website. Welcome, Lewis, a very warm welcome. Immediately after Lewis has spoken, speaking spontaneously, our first discussant is one of Cape Town's preeminent psychoanalytic practitioners, Mini Hognafji, who is a second-generation Indian African whose formative years were in Zimbabwe, and she's proudly grateful for her rural roots. She earned her higher degrees at the University of Zimbabwe and then at the University of Fort Hare. For the past 20 years, she has been, in her words, quote unquote, curiously immersing herself in psychoanalytic ways of thinking and working. She's now a psychoanalyst member of the International Psychoanalytic Association, and equally, in my view, equally significant to all these many accomplishments, because she has enormous talent and grace that she brings to her clinical work. She is an avid and accomplished watercolorist, painting mainly flora and fauna. And then we have, last but not least, Richard Pithouse. Richard Pithouse, as people in South Africa readily know, is an eminent scholar, journalist, and activist based in Johannesburg. Since 1995, he's taught philosophy and politics at several South African universities and published widely in academic books and journals, with a particular focus on Frantz Fanon and popular struggles in South Africa. He contributes regularly to South African media as a columnist and is the editor of New Frame. His book, Writing the Decline, was a bestseller. Richard has worked with social movements and trade unions for 3 decades and taught in trade union and social movement political schools in South Africa and elsewhere. He founded the Commune Bookshop and The Forge, a space for public discussions, performances, and exhibitions in Braamfontein. Currently, he's a distinguished research fellow at the Global Center for Advanced Studies in New York and Dublin, and he is an international research scholar at the University of Connecticut, an extraordinary professor at the University of the Western Cape, and political coordinator for the Progressive International. A warm welcome to you, Richard. I, as chair, am discussant, am Barnaby Barrett. I'm a Johannesburg psychoanalyst trained in the global north, and I'm going to say a little more about myself, except for shameless self-promotion. I was the author, or am the author, of an award-winning trilogy called Rediscovering Psychoanalysis, the trilogy. I've also, I think it's fair to say, been a long-time activist for human rights and civil liberties, particularly of queer populations. And I'm a passionate practitioner, first and foremost, a practitioner as a critic presents itself today. And last piece of shameless promotion, my next book, Free Association, A Contemporary Introduction, is to be released by Routledge in May of this year. So let us begin. I'm really, truly honored to hand over to you, Professor Lewis Gordon, to speak to us on dignity, evil, and love.
To the audience, to everybody who will look at this in the future, I'm here in New England, so I'll begin with Winakisuk, which is Wampanoag, for hello. And we could go to ancient times to Hotep, which is from the language of Meruneter, the language of the people who were eventually colonized, and their name changed, the country's name changed to Egypt. So Hotep. Shalom and Assalamu alaikum. Those are terms with which many of you are familiar, including Hujambo, Namaste, Parakam, Misawa, Mimwega, Domela, Mulweni, Saubona, and for some others, Bonjour, Bon dia, Buenos dias, hello, and of course, since I was born in Jamaica, Wagwan. Thanks, Barnaby, for many things, not only for the invitation for this meeting, but also conversations over the years, and also for your work. I've read it with great profit. And I'm using that in a very positive sense. My students always thank me for assigning your work, and I'm so delighted that I've had a relationship with your writings over the years. Richard Pithouse Wow, it's hard to believe that it's now going, wow, we're entering 4 decades of friendship. And similarly for your work, Richard, you work under conditions of that are often very challenging. It's very difficult for people to understand the importance of courage among intellectuals today. And with much of what you've faced, and the thing about it that some people don't understand is we don't always have to be right, but at a certain level, one has to be willing to take the risk of being wrong in order to learn, at least to be better. And that's something I've always admired about you. Bamin Rugnati, it's so good to get to meet you virtually. And I'm sending my best wishes to Darlene Miller. I hope the extenuating circumstances work out. And of course, to the community who has gathered here. I hope you find this a very useful conversation. Now, the title is connected to a study on which I'm working. I usually am working on several things at once. Some people do things seriatim, but for me, everything is connected. So as I'm working on other projects, I'm also working on a book on dignity, evil, and love. Okay. Now, I'm also going to begin with a reflection on our times. This is just, we're plagued by a form of nihilism that occasions also pessimism for many. A lot of people don't make the distinction between pessimism and nihilism. Nihilism is also, as Nietzsche pointed out, symptomatic of decadence. We're in a moment right now of profound decay. But pessimism is also a very complicated phenomenon to think about because some people think that the opposite of pessimism is optimism, but they may not realize that pessimism and optimism are two sides of the same coin, that ultimately they come from a certain epistemic attitude in which one is invested in the notion of a kind of a relationship to a kind of predictability or ability to forecast the future. And if there's a failure to do so, or an in advance judgment, one also has pessimism. Now, one of the things that we're dealing with in our times, of course, is global authoritarian leadership. And that exemplifies this nihilism in two forms from what we know as, in the language of the right, the political right, but it also affects elements of what we call the left, the political left. On the right, in psychoanalytical terms, there's a form of regression of longing for powerful fathers. And by the way, this longing, as you could see in the US context, when we think back to people who said if they don't get Bernie Sanders, they're going to go for Donald Trump, means for them, as long as it's a strong father, it's irrelevant whether he's benevolent or he's cruel. And in some cases, if the fathers aren't going to make it, there's some people from the right who almost have a desire of returning to the womb. Now, of course, if you try to return to the womb, there's something embedded in that kind of a logic, because as we know, a mother can be killed unless the mother is a goddess. And in that framework, the idea of an absolute protection, this quest for absolute security, is part of the rightward turn. Now, on the left, there's a form of anti-authority among too many that exemplifies declining political agency. But this decline has an additional insidious form when understood from the perspective of those who step into the roles of leadership with a peculiarly nihilistic disorder in that they reject the idea of a world without them. And this is something unique about this moment, because there have always been people who are full of themselves. There've always been people who are cruel. But there's something that's different about the kind of cruelty we're seeing today. Right? If you look particularly from the category, I don't like the term West and East, but at the moment, it's geographically more the West. You have individuals who think their death, which they try never to imagine, is for them the death of the world. And because that scale of narcissism is such that it's blinding them from seeing beyond themselves, they're willing to sacrifice the world in their imagined effort never to die. And I'm sure the therapists in the room can, every time they look at someone like Donald Trump in the Oval Office and see all the gold and all the things he's building up, one has a sense that this is a person who's trying to create an entire wall. The very fact that he's trying even to build a structure and put his name on things, that exemplifies this notion of never to die. Now, this is a thesis that is going to unfold in some of the reflections that follow. This obsession of permanence, of never dying, is not only in terms of what we see in Trump, but it's also what we're seeing, unfortunately, in many of the actions that we're seeing coming out of Israel. And in the context of an area like Iran, it's very different because, as we know, there's a different logic if one imagines that death is more a conduit, it's more a transition to paradise. Within that framework, then, we're talking about different kinds of disorders, but nevertheless, they connect in some of the issues I will be discussing. Now, I begin with dignity because it connects to some degree to what everyone wants. There are people who may claim they're not looking for dignity, but if we spell out what dignity is about, we'll have a clue of why it's so important. Now, while well known and debated among psychoanalysts, I like Simone de Beauvoir, the existential philosopher Simone de Beauvoir's observation from Point Moral d'Ambiguïté, known in English as The Ethics of Ambiguity, which begins from the perspective of a child going through developmental processes into adolescence and chronological adulthood. And you may notice I say chronological adulthood because a chronological adult, well, is not necessarily an adult. This is a path from the joy of naive play to the trepidations of realized insecurity. There's a form of bad news that haunts everyone, but we build a whole lot to avoid it. And the bad news, of course, is that nobody's a god. And because none of us is a god, nobody is absolutely safe. Nobody is absolutely secure. While everyone would like to be safe, everyone in the social realm moves from mere pleasure to being valued by virtue of love, and beyond the intimate, being valued by virtue of respect. Not to value any of these may ultimately entail not regarding oneself as valuable. So that's the basic point. If you're going to just throw being valued out the window, you have to say you also are not valuable. Now, of course, if one values oneself to the point of making others completely irrelevant, if one values oneself too much, one may stand as a god or at a level of self-worth that is solipsistic and thus a form of narcissistic disorder. In fact, radical narcissistic disorder. In the spectrum, then, there are forms of understandable levels of narcissism. You should like yourself enough, value yourself enough. But healthy forms involve at least a value of being valued, which by implication requires a world of others. Frantz Fanon, on whom Richard and I have written quite a bit, rather strikingly in Peau Noire, Masque Blanc, Black Skin, White Mask, had said from the outset that a lot of the problems he's going to discuss ultimately come down to problems of narcissism. And in my book, Fear of Black Consciousness, it's rather striking because there were some people who freaked out when I pointed out, for instance, that the very notion of white supremacy is a form of narcissistic disorder. That ultimately it's a cultivated notion of being a subject that is entitled to everything, everything. And the very idea of losing anything is treated as a form of injustice and victimization. I found it rather amusing that there were some critics in their review of the book who said, "That is not me. That is not me." And I kept cracking up thinking how much in their actual critique they were manifesting a form of narcissism. Because I don't know them. How is it that they're defending themselves individually? There is also a rather interesting influencer, YouTuber, who picked up on this. And her site is, she says she's looking for a name change, that instead of white supremacy, we should say white narcissism. But that, all of those are in the category of disorder. And as we know, narcissism is not unique to any race. It goes across all categories. Now, my decision to focus on dignity, of course, is because when I think about what Beauvoir said, I think also about what many of us think about, which is the question of worth, of value. There are these moments where we experience a sense of not being valued, whether it is real or imagined. I remember, for instance, when my youngest child one day heard a group of us, the rest of the family, laughing and looking at photos. And he was really excited to go look into the photo album. But we were looking at an album of pictures before he was born. And when he looked, and as we're going through, he became very, very sad. And we asked, what's wrong? And we used to call him Mr. Poppy. And he said, "Where is Mr. Poppy?" And it struck us, or rather it struck me, that although he was 4 years old, and of course, most of us, when we think back to when we were babies or children, the thing about a 4-year-old is when he looked at other pictures, he saw himself as a baby, but he doesn't remember being that baby. But he saw himself. But in those pictures, he wasn't there. So we were committing a profound act for him of, well, injustice. Because how dare we celebrate a time in which he did not exist? And to make matters even worse, we looked very happy. You could imagine then, for many, the idea that there could be, or in fact not could be, there was a time in which the world was perfectly fine without us, and there will be a time again in which it would be perfectly fine without us. This raises a rather profound reflection, not only in children, but for those all the way through their deathbed around the question of our value. Now, dignity discourses, as we know, receive criticisms of self-inflation. It is often confused with pride, but pride is a vice that is different. It's wrong to slide it into pride, mainly because dignity is also a virtue. Now, some critics, such as Arthur Schopenhauer in the 19th century, and following him Nietzsche, criticize, for instance, Kant, the German philosopher Kant's formalistic conception of dignity. Because for Kant, dignity is being equal in the realm of ends. But Schopenhauer's influence, interestingly, includes Freud, whose conception moves from the formal to addressing our relationship to our unconscious drives. But that raises questions more about causes of an affect that we may call dignity instead of the concept dignity. We should, however, avoid treating Kant as the last word or primary exemplar of such an age-old concept. Dignity in Judaism, for example, applies also to the dead. And it's rather striking when we think about it in Judaism, because you see, there are societies in which the value afforded the dead is connected to the dead as ancestors within a metaphysics that has them still present. But within a system in which when you're dead, fully dead, gone, permanent, forever, no more. How do you afford, why do you bother with dignity for the dead? This is something rather insightful about dignity and value. And as you could see in my discussion, it'll connect also to love. Now, too often, some critics look at concepts, such as, for instance, dignity, from what Bergson would call the outside. If you try to look at it from the inside, many presuppositions would fall apart. And by the way, one thing I'd like to say ahead is that even though I'm bringing up European philosophers at the moment, it would be a mistake to think of these terms exclusively in European forms. Every society has some conception of dignity. If you look into Medu-Neter, for instance, when I said Hotep, the language, Medu-Neter language goes back several thousand years. You have the concept of, for instance, Saer, which is a rather interesting concept because Saer also is linked to terms that the basic root term of wisdom. So in that society, there's a kind of wisdom that's linked to dignity. And if in Hebrew, you can have, for instance, kavod. And again, kavod is a complex term because Hebrew came also out of Medu-Neter, and the cha in there is also linked also to life. And if you look in, for instance, varieties of African societies, for instance, among the Akan, you have Animon Nyam, and Nyam, which is linked to Nyame, is also linked to the notion of God. So there are all kinds, and we already know in the South African context, from Zulu to Xhosa and other languages, or the more Bantu-oriented languages, there's a connection of dignity all the way through from concepts like Isithunzi to all the way through to Ubuntu, in which dignity unfolds. But given the limitations of time, I'm just going to just work within the English-speaking framework. Now, one of the things that's very weird is when people attack dignity. I've always found that rather problematic because, you see, dignity is something that's really connected to our humanity, the question of being valued. As we see, for instance, if we look at various struggles, whether it's the anti-apartheid struggle, if you look at the civil rights struggle in the United States, many struggles, even in struggles where people could be on opposite sides. The thing is, there's a way when people are being dehumanized that they inaugurate a struggle for liberation, a struggle for freedom, in which they compartmentalize themselves in their walk, in their talk, and in their dress in ways that pertain to dignity. There are times when people are degraded. You could see them fix their clothes, straighten up their body, orient themselves for dignity. And this is because if we think about dehumanization as something wrong, then part of a practice of humanization, a practice of restoring our humanity, requires also the constitution of dignity. You've seen this in many struggles, as I've already mentioned, not only the United States, you see in Brazil, Colombia, Dominican Republic, France, Israel, Palestine, Italy, Japan, Kuwait, Pakistan, South Africa, the UK, in other words, everywhere. However, there are moments in which some people make fun of dignity also, because there are times for them dignity seems ridiculous. If you think about when people, for instance, would dress their best to go to a protest where they're going to be sprayed with water or, you know, um, tear gas, all kinds of things, dog sicked on them. There are people who say this is ridiculous. You should be dressed to fight. But you see, part of that dress was to articulate and say in one's dress, in one's comportmentality, I am a human being. Now, saying you're a human being is not to say that other kinds of beings don't matter. It's just saying in the context of dehumanization, your humanity matters. And this compartmentalization reminds me of a proverb from Kenya. I heard it by John Mabiti said it. And I remember he said it at a panel. And the proverb is, if you're taking a bath and a man steals your clothes, put something on before you chase him. Now, if we return to the point about being human beings, okay, we know, for instance, and there's subtle ways we've talked about this, at a basic child level, if you're beaten in the playground, you run home to a place to be embraced, to be a place of being valued. When you're born, you come out of your mother's womb, you're held, but the embrace, the very comportmentality of being embraced is an act of valuing you. You could come out and just drop on the floor and people walk away, but the very premise of the human condition is already linked into this question of value. And as I've already mentioned, there are forms of being value, of being worthy that we looked at. And when we go out into the social world, we're looking to be valued in the form of respect. So dignity is relational. Now, dignity requires doing what ultimately makes one worthy. And in fact, you could look up, in the different languages, whatever people really value, they tend to link with dignity. It connects along the axis into the question of living a life worth living. So if you take dignity out, the very project of living a valuable life is degraded. Anti-Black racism, for example, as I've argued in my book, Bad Faith in Anti-Black Racism, ultimately assaults Black life with an endless stream of lies that amount to the conclusion that the world is better without Black people. In short, Black lives are not worth living in from the perspective of an anti-Black society. And it's no accident, for instance, in the Black Lives Matter movement, when they're saying matter, what they're saying is valuable, is worthy of dignity and respect. To say Black in and of itself, however, is misleading because the context, as we know, of anti-Black racism is, after all, also a patriarchal one, in addition to a history of valorized capitalism, Christological notions of purity. There's anti-Black racism in the Islamic world, and it also has notions of purity and white megalomania. Now, if we think back to that childhood imagination of parents that Beauvoir talked about, one of the issues that emerged there is that from children's point of view, adults are gods. And this raises a rather interesting problem when we think about how we struggle for dignity under radically unequal circumstances. For instance, Black children in anti-Black societies are rarely, if ever, afforded such a luxury of really looking at their parents as gods, because they, at a very young age, see the degradation of their parents. The idea that Black men can protect their children in white supremacist and anti-Black societies is constantly under attack at any moment they walk outside. or if they can afford it, drive with their children or other loved ones. The humiliations of an anti-Black racist society, from the behavior of the police to the complex array of aggression, ranging from lynchings to fears of them doing something wrong, even sadly among other Black people, produces a profound attack on their dignity. And this attack on their dignity creates a profound level of insecurity among such children, which also already makes this question then of a profound kind of insecurity take a peculiarly gendered form. Observing this effect on Black boys, for example, who are expected to replace their fathers, you could see the problem. Because how are you going to long to replace your father? In other words, a childhood desire to become gods, if as a child you see immediately that your father is not a god. Its impact on Black girls is one of profound confusion, since the social lie is that only white men can protect anybody. And that's a lie, because eventually every white person learns that nobody is ultimately safe. It was rather striking, for instance, I noticed among the award-winning artist Carol Walker. She does these silhouettes, race silhouettes, right? And they're often of grotesque sexual scenes of Black girls with white men. What many people don't realize is they emerge out of the degeneration she witnessed of her father, who was a painter and a professor who moved from California to Georgia. When he moved from a context in which he's now in a heavily racist, anti-Black environment, right? That degeneration, often for the sake of survival, because he had to make a living, is at times characterized as shuffling, of having to walk in ways that allay the fears of people who fear Black men. And I could tell you, as a Black professor and a Black Jewish professor who has moved through the world in ways in which I'm not afraid of white people, I'm not afraid of white men. I have had many encounters in which there are white men who find that absolutely threatening and outrageous. In fact, it's interpreted as arrogance. There's a language where it's called uppity. Okay? And so, but it's interesting from a Black daughter's point of view. I recommend a book called Up Home, One Girl's Journey from Ruth Simmons, who was the first Black person to become president of an Ivy League university in the United States. It was at Brown, where I used to teach. She recounts what anti-Black racism did to her father in rural Texas in her childhood. And if we think about Richard Wright's Uncle Tom's Children, there's so many examples of this. As an adult, Ruth Simmons' reflection in her childhood poses a rather interesting question, because she thought about the precarity of authority. She really loved her father, but she realized she went through a form of guilt, because at a certain point she despised her father because she could not see him as a man. But then, as an adult woman, understanding that this man's love for his daughters, for his family, was such that he had to make extraordinary decisions for their survival. And this is something faced in India, for instance, among Dalit fathers. There's a wonderful film, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It'll come back to me, but where many people talk about the son in the film, but it's the father, what he had to do. The whole film tells an extraordinary story about a Dalit father who's trying to raise money for a dowry for his daughter, and the humiliations he has to go through, what he has to endure through his love for his daughter. So a Black boy's loss of respect for Black fathers, right, often takes many forms. If you think about, for instance, in African America, there's a little thing called the dozens, and that the dozens always begin with a put down. Your mama is so, your daddy is so, right? It goes after the parents, and it's rich with psychoanalytical content. But the dozens pose a crisis of what to become without models. What can be made if becoming one's father is, in effect, a disappointment? In other words, your childhood experience of saying the absolute last thing you ever want to be is your mother or father. But in this case, because of the structure of these fathers, this raises the question that haunts you of whether you are a disappointment. And what could be posed if a deeply rooted anger at one's father's failure to render one safe would haunt one's simultaneous love for him? Now, this entire story can take many forms, but I bring it up because, of course, how it's linked to very important questions of dignity. One may think about mothers in this context. The context of patriarchy, for instance, poses many contradictions in daughters, and the time it would take to explore this and add complexities to becoming women would also pertain today to the complex question of trans women, right? Because in a way, a question posed for a trans woman could be becoming my mother as an expression of love or fearing becoming my mother. What would that be an expression of? In my book, Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, and my book, Fear of Black Consciousness, I offer discussions of mothers, especially Frederick Douglass' mother, Harriet Bailey, and the power of radical love they can bring to their children. But we should remember, not all women are mothers, and some are so involuntarily, and others choose not to be and succeed in not being such. The question of becoming women is one long debated in feminist and gender theory. Obviously, Judith Butler is one of the great exemplars of that discussion. And then there are those who, as we know, essentialize female and gendered women's subjectivity, including in psychoanalytical terms. And there are others who regard the subject woman as problematic among many problematic appeals to subjects. Now, what I would say here is this. There are many contradictions to reductive thesis on the lived reality of Black people, but I could extend it beyond Black people. I'm mentioning Black people because to take away the question of dignity is to take away something very fundamental for which we struggle. And as you can see in the beginning, I'm arguing that this is actually universal. It's actually across all humankind. Everywhere I go, this question of when you're born, the question is, are you worth having in the world? Is your life worth living? And these are issues that are discussed all around the place. But among Black women, you could see it in Anna Julia Cooper's A Voice from the South in the late 19th century, to Angela Y. Davis, to Nkira Nzegwo from Nigeria, or Renke Oyeyumi from Nigeria. You could also see it in the late Drusilla Cornell, and I already mentioned Judith Butler's work, both of whom take psychoanalysis seriously. They attest to, what they attest to is that none of what we understand about gender, race, and human identity is complete. And because we are a fundamental incompleteness, we struggle with that ongoing insecurity. In other words, part of our developmental issue is how to reach a point in which we are able to live in meaningful ways with a radical absence of certainty and the idea that we're absolutely safe. Now, the current constellation of who we are is not the final story of human reality. I noticed that Barney brought up that he does work in queer studies or on queer populations. And there's an insight in queerness. And the insight in queerness is it doesn't matter who you think you are, you're not the end of the story. Human possibilities aren't simply us. Human possibilities are many to come. Other kinds of us are viable possibilities. Psychoanalysis here then can be looked at also as a decolonial practice. And I'm not here talking about decoloniality. That's a different concept. I'm just talking about liberating us from the constrictions of closure. That means it reaches beyond our identities into the question of living with the question that so many of us ask, which is whether, given what we become, Are our lives proverbially worth living or less grandiose? Are we worthy? So dignity is a core question that we should explore. And in many ways, and some of you who are practicing therapists, I'm sure have experienced a moment where your patient is really asking you, am I valuable? Now, this question of worth, of course, links to the question of adult life and the question of maturation. And if we think about maturation, we should bear in mind the psychoanalytical story has much more than what I've outlined. There's a lot I could talk about it, but the main thing is that if we begin to block, to close off, to impede the idea of maturation, we impede processes through which we can become basically grown-ups. But there are other things that are at work as well, because you see, there are those who may want us to stay into the kind of naive folly of children. But there's a certain point when we get much older, there are certain things that are frankly undignified. And one of the reasons they're undignified, because they're acts in the participation of which diminishes us. But of course, the danger, if we're going to be reactionary, is the error of interpreting the rejection of childish play as that of rejecting play in toto. The complicated question of maturity is understanding how it is appropriate to live, given the experiences and relationships in that stage of one's life. One of my former students, Tom Marr, has written on this question for his dissertation, which was on maturity, and he's writing a book on maturity in that regard. What is this then but the narcissism that Fanon declared he will not give up? The good narcissism of trying to become a valuable human being. Now, of course, this is a paradox because you're born human and you spend your life trying to become human. It is one of belonging to human reality as worthy of the respect it affords. So when we realize this, we know the clue that happens in adult life. It always struck me as rather unusual. I love to see very elderly people, and by elderly, I mean people in their 90s or 100 years old, sitting on a bench in the park. Because one of the things when I look at them, and sometimes when I speak with them, what you will often discover is that that person, despite age, is thinking, why do I still feel like a child? And it's that moment they begin to think through. They begin to think through wondering why they feel like a child, the question of what is this dignity afforded by old age? The question is not above divergences and delaying the inevitable, which is death, but instead appreciating the moments, even if that means simply letting things be as one no longer takes oneself too seriously. That's not the same thing as losing one's dignity. So those are little pastiche explorations of the question of dignity. And it has an interesting hook, which is with dignity, you ultimately don't take yourself too seriously. And it affords being able to take others seriously enough. So this brings me to evil and to love. I focused a lot on dignity because when you see dignity, evil, and love, people are wondering, why in the world is he bringing these three together? Well, the thing about evil, there's so many things about evil. I mean, evil just permeates our mythic literature. And by the way, there's a wonderful book by the psychiatrist James Gilligan. It's on violence. Those of you who don't know, many of you may know his partner, or Carol Gilligan. She did, the feminist in a different voice. That psychologist, Carol Gilligan. But James Gilligan, uh, he did something rather interesting because I write a lot on myth, and he has in this book an interesting discussion of myth. And his discussion of myth comes from his experience as a psychiatrist working in prisons. And he doesn't want to do the apologetic rationalization of people approach. He has worked with people who are absolutely guilty, who absolutely did what they did, and some of them were the most horrific crimes. And what James Gilligan reflected on as he went through these patients, he realized that, wow, a lot of what we read in myth, whether it's from Oedipus, all the way through, Chronos and Kronos, or, all the way through Isis, Osiris, a lot of Heracles, a lot of these myths, if you could go through all the way, even myths that you could find many African myths, all the way through to Nancy. He says he is absolutely convinced that myths are like the game of telephone, which is that they ultimately point back to real events, that there are horrible things that happen that as told over time. And the word myth is from the word mythos, which means from the mouth. It is told, repeated over and over, that ultimately myths are not only a level of meaning that we decode, but they're also telling us something about what people do. And the word evil is rather striking because the word evil is linked to the English word bad, which interestingly enough it's in many other languages you don't really have that. You have words that connect like vicious, wicked, etc. But evil, it's rather striking because you see evil, while every language has some version of evil and they have a mythopoetics of evil, it's rather curious how they unfold. For instance, in the several thousand-year-old Nether language, the word bin refers to evil. But what's interesting is it's separate from evil acts, which is in the word ir. And that word is linked in a very interesting connection with irt, which means eye. And everybody knows about the evil eye. So already at a basic psychoanalytical level, evil is already something that takes a form of seeing and being seen. If you look at almost every story about evil, something is revealed, something or a person wrapped in evil is so caught in a visual frozenness that evil is made manifest. It's even rather striking because in Hebrew, the word ra, which is also for evil, is also linked to rasha, wickedness, which is rather striking given the history of how it transformed the sun god Re, which, sorry, I do a lot in linguistic archaeology, that comes to the fore. Or if you think of Bauna in Akan, there are all kinds of words in which evil may be made manifest. But for the sake of time, I'm going to go through the rest more in the form of allegory. I do think when we think about evil, and one of the things that's striking in James Gilligan's work on evil, and many others I've seen on evil, is that they all point to something that I've also observed. And that is, it's not enough simply to look at an evil act, but in order to study evil, just as Bergson talked about how to study a phenomenon, you have to get inside the phenomenon. To study evil, you need to go inside and try to see an evil perspective. And for many people, this is something that they shudder at the thought of doing. And to do this, one has to take away the supernatural conception of evil because the supernatural treats it as something that will come from outside onto us. But once we move the supernatural out and look at evil within the human world, we realize that evil persists. And it persists without a supernatural and a non-human source, although there are many societies in which people still think of evil objects. I had a friend, for instance, where some friends that came over at a potluck and had cooked something that was absolutely awful. It was terrible food. So, but they left the pot because they liked it and they thought, we could finish it. And it was just so awful we couldn't finish it. But when we washed out the pot, this friend of mine saw the pot and she said, "Take that pot out of the house." So that's an imputing to a physical object evil. However, if we think about this question of evil, of looking into evil, there's something I've always noticed. And I noticed this recently when I was speaking with a group of students who were uh, uh, going on about certain wrongs, etc., in which I said to them, in all my studies of evil, every exemplification of evil has articulated itself as a victim. And this is one of the things that James Gilligan found. The most horrific examples, people who have sliced up others, chopped them up. And by the way, a lot of the people who commit grotesque physical acts of evil almost always gouge out the eyes and cut out the tongue. And these are, you could already see what's connected there, the idea of being seen. Well, we already know in Dante's Inferno, there is at the center of going down into hell, at the center of hell. Many people in Christological form often think of hell as this hot place, but in Dante's Inferno, the center is cold. The center is cold, and at the center is Satan, so consumed by evil that he could not even move. And when we think about this example of the immobilization that is created by evil, we begin to realize, if we think back at dignity, how evil is already connected to the erasing of others. In other words, to be so consumed by something one does not want to see that one needs to eliminate others. I think one of the best portraits of evil is Melvin's Moby Dick. I gave a talk recently. I know some people will be upset at me because Toni Morrison had given a talk where she talked about the white whale in Moby Dick as white supremacy, and I disagree with her. I read Moby Dick as a study of evil, but the evil is not the whale. The evil in Moby Dick is Captain Ahab. Because if you look in Moby Dick, Ahab is so consumed by his hatred of the whale that bit off his leg that he's willing to take the entire crew of the Pequod, which is an allegory for the earth, for the world, on a singular pursuit of killing this whale. And many of you, if you don't know the story, and many of you do, but for those who don't know the story, it culminates in all of them singularly focused on killing this whale, to the point where Ahab jumps onto the whale and sticks a harpoon into his blubber, and he's trying to kill the whale, and the whale just goes down to the bottom of the sea and drowns him and swims on after it destroys the Pequod. So we have a thesis here about evil, which is that evil manifests itself as being so concentrated on eliminating the object of one's hatred that one is willing to destroy the world, indeed all of reality, to achieve that goal. And when we think of the absurdity of this, because the whale just went whale. I mean, the whale was just minding its own business, and these whalers came to try to kill it. It defended itself, bit off his leg, and went on its way. But the malignant narcissism of Ahab is connected to an inflation of the self that says that almost at a Theodician level, that it's actually against all reality to harm him. That whale had to be brought to account. And we've seen this in many forms of leadership today. We see this, I was being very serious when I said at the outset that we are right now under the grip of world leaders who are caught in a mindset in which they have no interest in the world beyond their own death. And and all of them, if you listen to the narrative of every single one of them, they see themselves, their countries, which they see as extension of themselves, as victims. And this form of victimology is the rationalization of being willing to destroy everything. And of course, the obvious performative contradiction, even themselves, just to destroy what they hate. So this tells us that although there's a tendency to separate the political from the psychoanalytical has a lot to say about what is happening globally today. It would be so great if these individuals were not running countries and instead were either going through therapy or just disarmed of power to the point of becoming irrelevant. But we know this. We see what's happening with Netanyahu and Likud in Israel. The whole idea of how many are to be killed for what this individual is doing. We see it in Iran, the absolute hatred of Israel in the United States. We see it in many parts all across the globe, of forms of manifestation of purity and cleansing to eliminate others, even at one's expense. It's happening not only across the African continent, and it's happening across parts of Asia. This is a global phenomenon right now. And it means that we need to take seriously examining evil and it's not only its metaphysical and psychoanalytical elements, but also its political implications. And so I'm going to conclude with love. Because obviously, with all of what I said about evil right now, it's pretty obvious evil destroys. And when I opened up with dignity, the very idea of being valued, to be worth, right? And it's interesting enough in the English language, the word worth is also linked to the word truth because they both have origins in worth. And so the idea is to be worthy of trust. Well, to be worthy, to be valuable is life affirming. And this is an element of love. But of course, there are many ways of talking about love. And as we know, as I talked about narcissism, there are forms of love that actually paradoxically exclude the other. I do think that one of the best texts, the best studies of narcissistic disorder love is also connected to what I said about evil. An interesting political text is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Many know the films, but really you should read the book. Because Victor Frankenstein, and it's interesting because the name Victor, victorious, conqueror, Frankenstein means freedom. So the victory over freedom. But as we know, it's never that simple because as existential psychoanalysts would remind us, many people have a desire not to be free. In other words, if we try to harken back to the childhood moment of liberty without responsibility, because one would say that's only a child, then it's a desire for a kind of license in which one cannot be responsible for one's actions. So freedom, because at a mythopoetic level and a deeper level of understanding freedom, freedom carries responsibility. That's the core insight in the Adam and Eve story, for instance, which is the knowledge, the freedom carries responsibility. The thing about it is that some people may not want that responsibility. And when Victor Frankenstein awakens the creature, Victor Frankenstein wanted to see an analog of himself. That is analogical narcissistic love. But at the same time, what he saw was actually radical difference. And he recoiled and fled responsibility. And we know the tragedy that unfolds. But as we know in colonialism tried to assert itself as if the reproduction of itself, but at the same time, it rejects the imitation of itself in the colonized. And so what we see with analogical notions of love is actually something in a banal way that we immediately recognize. If someone says, I love you, and you, in a philosophical mood, ask why, and the person says, because I love myself, then that means that person is not seeing the beloved. They're just mirroring themselves. But of course, the question is, if they're gone and a mirror continues, what is that a mirror of? Well, one of the things about love that's crucial is that we human beings have the capacity to love that which is not radically the duplication of the self. If we put away the narcissistic disorder analogical love and think through radical love, which is the ability to affirm the right of the radically different to exist. Now we have a very different conception of love that could be linked to libertarian practices, dignity, and struggles against evil. And what that is this. If we think of love as a judgment, not simply of the existence of the other, but of that the ought added to that existence. In other words, those who ought to exist, the ought, the prescriptive element, then one faces something rather profound, which is that one can facilitate for another a life worth living, even if one will not witness it, will not partake in it. And this is something allegorically in a lot of ancient myths. I love how it took its form in the story of Aaron, Miriam, and Moses. Because many may not realize this, but Aaron, Miriam, and Moses never entered the promised land. And I've seen that as a profound political allegory, that is that which is worth fighting for is that which transcends you. You have to be gripped with such an important, profound form of love that you're fighting for the other's right to have a livable life in their own terms. It's fundamentally, in a word, queer. And this queerness can take so many forms. You could see it in the writings of Martin Buber, but you could see it also in not only writings of Frantz Fanon, when Fanon says at the end of Le Damné de la Terre, The Damned of the Earth, that you should set the conditions for a new humanity. And he argues throughout that text that that humanity may transcend your terms. They're not necessarily a reproduction of you. So radical love, it strikes me, as is an important response that's implicit. It's an existential commitment to make the world better, even if you will not inhabit it. And this is a clue that's linked into maturity, because ultimately, what one does, if we go back to what I talked about with parenting, when I talked about with the question of value and forms of love, even when I talked about that Dalit father, is an understanding that part of our humanity and part of our maturity is to live a life worth living as understood, as acting for what is greater than ourself. Thank you.
Wow. Lewis, no wonder I was told you got standing ovations for this talk when you gave it at various places on the East Coast. That was beyond words superlative. So we're going to go increasingly to a discussion between the four of us. And Bhamini, you have the privilege and honor, or maybe the challenge, of being the first person to contribute your thoughts, your feelings, your associations, or whatever you wish in response to what you've heard from Lewis. Bhamini.
Thank you, Bonmi. Yes, I was a bit nervous to be the first one to respond, but there was so much. There was so much that came up for me, and I'll start with the things right at the end because they're the freshest in my mind. But there was something about what popped into my mind was around the radical love that, and I've read this somewhere and I can't remember where, but that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And it's being indifferent, there is no action, there is no forward movement into the ought that someone else's life ought to be. So if you're indifferent, it just translates to inactive and not moving in that direction. So that came into my mind. And then just before that, I had also been thinking about, how we all move through the world. What parts of ourselves do we split off, disavow, deny, maybe we're not aware of, to survive? And this was in relation to what you had talked about parents, and how the children see their parents and what they take in, and about protection. And if your parents are not seen to be able to protect, what do you do inside yourself to protect yourself, and how do you then move through the world? Is it having an idea of yourself, an unconscious idea of yourself as, well, I'm going to move through the world as white woman or man, with a kind of a certain intellect or power, or if I think about I'm thinking about growing up, or in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, around apartheid, and what that would have meant, and what kind of a child would then take up to survive, to move through the world, not unknowingly. So that's what I thought about, of what are the bits that we cut off to survive. And then, and it also has an element of violence. What violence do we do to ourselves to move through the world? And are we aware of it? And how incredibly painful it is when we become aware of it. That, oh, I might be moving through the world, seeing myself as a white woman with a shotgun, right? But I'm a brown woman who doesn't have a shotgun. And how violent that could be. So those are the things that popped in my mind immediately. And there was one other thing right at the beginning about dignity, and I have forgotten, but it will come back to me.
Well, thank you. Maybe
Yeah,
Richard.
thank you,
Also,
Pamini. Lewis, I think we can be guided by you. Do you have anything you would immediately like to say, or shall we go and hear Richard and then you come back to all of us? How would you feel you wanted to do it?
oh, let's go to Richard and then come
Okay,
back.
fine. Richard, please, your turn.
Thank you, Barnaby, and thank you to Lewis and Barmany. I mean, as you said, Barnaby, this is incredibly rich. There's so many points of entry, you know. There's so many profound things here. But I'm very struck by the importance of thinking about dignity in a serious way. And Lewis did so in a political way. Beginning his talk with just acknowledging, how perilous and dangerous and devastating the times we live in are. Um, you know, um, there's the dignity is often seen as something that people can insist on. You can insist on it because you're white or because you've got money, because you have the right things. But what Lewis is talking about is something very, very different. He's talking about dignity as an interrelational thing, about an intersubjectively constituted sense of worth. And when we think about what happens when people are denied dignity, I mean, of course, this can happen in intimate spaces and families and so on, but structurally, socially, what is the opposite of dignity? And for many people, it's depression, you know. I mean, South Africa, mass youth unemployment. There are young people all over the country who, you know, are asleep at 11 in the morning. Or, we also, as in the US, we have a huge opioid epidemic. I mean, it's masked here because of racism, because we always say people are taking these strange drugs that are concoctions of rat poison and ARVs and stuff. None of that is empirically true. It's opioids to comfort, to feel safer, to feel warmer. And how do people, and I'm no psychoanalyst, but I would imagine that how do people try and overcome that depression? Well, one way is through reaching for a sense of power. And power can come in many forms, but the sense of power that we see stalking the US, we see it with Trump, we see it with ICE on the streets, we see it in our own country with xenophobic mobs, we see it with, as Lewis said, with Netanyahu. Power, and there can be an experience of power achieved through sadistic relations to the other. To make yourself feel powerful in relation to the other. And I mean, in fact, there is quite a psychoanalytically influenced political theorist in England called Richard Seymour who makes this argument that kind of, he's talking about England, but that kind of like reform politics, that xenophobic politics, that racist politics is a compensation for depression. Desperate people encouraged to turn on other desperate people to have a little sense of power. I mean, that's always been the logic of fascism. It's not only in fascism that we experience that, but this is fundamentally a force. And if we use Lewis's language, we could say an evil force that is at play in much of the world. and you think about the power that Trump has usurped for himself as a personality, sure, as a malignant narcissist, but also as a man with, the most powerful state, the most powerful military, the most powerful ideological apparatus available to anyone in probably human history. It's something we all have to think about. But a weakness of the introduction, reintroduction, of course, because I mean, I'm going to say the reintroduction of psychoanalytic ways of seeing the world into politics, because I mean, they're there in Fanon, they're there in Wilhelm Reich, I mean, they've been there for a long time, is that they often, what seems to me, are about criticizing power, and they're about criticizing the ways in which people um, are complicit with accepting the forms of oppressive power that are just so pervasive at the moment. But the psychoanalytical relation, I would imagine, in its essence, is not only about trying to discern something that the person who's being analyzed doesn't know about themselves, that it is fundamentally a humanistic, mutually respectful relationship predicated on radical listening. And that, I would imagine, is the sort of essence of the therapeutic possibilities that it has. I was very struck reading a long interview with a guy called Guillaume Boulos, who is taught philosophy, has written and is interested in psychoanalysis, ran for mayor of Sao Paulo unsuccessfully, but did very well. Going against this kind of sadistic politics, this malignant narcissism of Bolsonaro, a very Trumpian-like figure, who comes out of a social movement of the urban poor called the MTST in Brazil. And in this interview, he's asked what brought him into it, because he comes from a middle class background. He's not a person who has to go and live in a favela for material reasons. And he said that when he first connected with this movement, the thing that struck him the most was meeting a woman who said that she was suffering from depression, joining a movement of other dispossessed people, in which she was, going back to Lewis's points here, respected, part of a community, told and shown in not just in a theoretical way, but in an embodied collective way that she is a person of value. She said joining the MTST meant she could throw away her antidepressant pills. So instead of, you're a desperate, unemployed young person in South Africa or in America, I mean, instead of trying to sort of dull your pain with drugs or succumb to depression, and also instead of trying to have some sense of power by turning on other people, via a sort of sadistic impulse to frighten the other, to feel more powerful in relation to the other. Instead, you deal with your depression by creating and participating in intersubjective communities, which, it would be an overstatement to say those kinds of communities are premised on radical love, because that's a really radical thing to say. But that is not wholly unhelpful as a way of understanding these things. Barnaby, we spoke briefly on WhatsApp about this play we've both seen, Isita Sabantu, Enemy of the People, which is showing in Johannesburg until Sunday. It's at an extended run. It's an extraordinary theatrical production. And it's based on the life of a woman called Fagile Nshangas, who was assassinated in 2000, I think. She's one of many grassroots activists who knew, and I'm thinking here about what Lewis says about understanding that life existed before you, and the flow of life will continue after you, and the need to take that seriously, who knew that the political personal choices they were making would result in their death. I've known a few young people who've made exactly that choice in Durban. They knew that what they were doing was going to cost them their lives, and did it anyway. But that play, as beautiful and as extraordinarily well done as it is, lacks one key element. It doesn't show the practice of how people who are spurned by society, who are given a kind of constant pedagogy through society that says that they are not worthy, that they don't matter, together create the spaces in which they do, which of course would draw in things like the church and so on, which are in the play, but also through a political process of political meetings. And I don't think that it is coincidental that the only significant, at scale anyway, but I would say in terms of quality as well as quantity, project of building a new kind of political project in the 30 years since the formal end of apartheid, also like in Brazil, a movement of poor urban people, takes dignity. Lewis used the isiZulu term, isitunzi, absolutely seriously. It is fundamental. And very few people with academic training can understand that, because they've got pre-given theoretical concepts they want to impose onto the social life and political life. But it is that people are committed to. And the point is that, yes, you are struggling for a better world and a better life, but you are met in the moment of arrival in the political community via the meeting as a person who has dignity. Dignity is affirmed and performed in the moment of arrival. And it's not psychoanalytic in the sense that while people will, as they say, cough out their pain and have their pain received with care and respect, it's not about trying to understand things that are hidden from consciousness, but it is a therapeutic community nonetheless. So, listening to Lewis, I'm thinking about what are the alternatives to responding with sadism to avoid depression. And I think we have to think politically about creating communities of intersubjective mutual respect. And I want to be very clear that this is not in any way romantic or asking for something that doesn't exist in the world. These things do exist in the world. And I don't know enough about something like Zoran Mamdani's campaign in New York. I've read what I can, but I've seen hints that that project, that is a really significant project against the logic of Trump, was built by bringing people into discussions, bringing people into spaces together on that basis of a mutual respect for their dignity as a starting point, not just as an end point of a political project. So, yeah, thank you to Lewis and to Barmany and to you, Barnaby. And I think that we need to think about these things politically. And I think that Lewis gave us a lot to work with there.
Oh, Richard, that was absolutely fabulous. And actually, I think it was what I hoped for when I invited you, because your sensitivity to the importance of the collectivity and the political has to be brought in to the discussion here. Because I found myself as I started to think about these notions in advance of this, hearing Lewis's talk and somewhat anticipating what Lewis's take would be, though one can never anticipate Lewis. He's far too rich, diverse, and like a fireworks show for that. But I found myself retreating into my Buddhist training, and then realizing that on one level that is exceedingly unhelpful. I had like three thoughts, and I think we've got so many directions we could go here. Obviously, we could be here a long time. the first thought I had, and these are thoughts that I come at from certain sort of psychoanalysis. Problem with psychoanalysis uh, nowadays is that it's 90% bullshit, and it has fractionated itself into diverse schools that are mutually contradictory, never actually really engage in dialogue about the assumptions they make about the human condition. So one has to be careful when one talks about what psychoanalysis contributes. But from my perspective as a practicing psychoanalyst, I had three thoughts. One is dignity, and starting off with de Beauvoir and valuing the self. And I had difficulty with this because psychoanalysis shows so much that there is no self, that the self is essentially created from outside the self. There is no subject, that the subject essentially, in Lacanian terms at least, which I think have value here, is like a signifier that bounces along predetermined chains of meaning that the subject has no control over. How then can we talk about dignity? Can we talk about dignity and still acknowledge the assault on the notion of agency that is represented by psychoanalysis? Think, for instance, of Freud's claim that he was, or he brought the third great insult to the human condition, that agency and the centrality of agency is not a viable way to think about the human condition. And then I got to the notion of evil, and I actually went and reread about 6 books on the philosophy of evil. I re-looked at them in anticipation. And the interesting thing about evil that one has to decide is to do with its interiority. And in a way, from a psychoanalytic point of view, there's a lovely quote by W.H. Auden. Evil is unspectacular and always human, and shares our bed and eats at our table. One cannot, in a way, talk about evil as exterior, which means that we have to think about the most outrageously evil things that we know about, and we have to think about their interiority, or at least one has to consider it, and that Donald Trump is sort of not just out there. To what extent is he in here, in me? And which brings, I think, us to love and the whole question of death and the embrace of one's death. There's something I almost thought was paradoxical, Lewis, when on the one hand we have these people, I'm already doing it, these people who are so in denial of death that they have obsessed with permanence and would kill the world, would kill everyone, would kill all the people of Pequod on Pequod in order to attain some sort of fantasy of immortality, rather than the embrace of their own death and the embrace of the ancestors, which goes along with that. And it seems to me that when we get to love, it's very difficult to think of love in terms of attachment, because love is inherently ambiguous and ambivalent, and psychoanalysis teaches that there is not love independent of hatred from a psychoanalytic point of view, which makes it awfully difficult to think about what it means to desire to love, and to desire a lot, to embrace a love that in fact is an embrace of one's own deathfulness. There's much more that could be said, but I want to leave it there because I think, Lewis, we only have 20 more minutes left this evening, and I think we should leave it to you to respond to Bamini's most interesting comments and Richard's very powerful comments, and in whatever way you think would be useful to bring us around to some point of impermanent, temporary, and transitional conclusion for the evening.
Thank you, Barnaby. Richard, Bamini. There's an interesting connection in your responses. Some of what I talked about, for the sake of time, certain things I did not elaborate. But one of the things, if I we'll go backward. If I begin with the point about Beauvoir, Beauvoir's existentialism means that she's critical of the notion of the self. So that's what puts her in conversation with psychoanalysis. And I think that point when you brought up your Buddhism, there's an insight that really connects there, because a subtext of my argument is that, and why evil is a mediating term there, is, as we know in Buddhism, evil also emerges as an overinvestment and attachment to the notion of the self. And so this is why you notice the culminating thesis is about not taking yourself too seriously. A lot of Beauvoir's arguments, and again, I brought her up mainly because what I like is, as an existential feminist, she also took very seriously development. So she moves from the naive and phenomenological terms to the maturation process of what we have to let go in adult life. So there is a form of narcissistic investment in childhood that produces this notion of the self. And for some people, the point at which realizing that self is not absolute and impermeable, some want to retreat back into the lie of childhood and construct a version which is the conservative path. It's a path to juvenility, blah, blah, blah. Fascism, all of that, in a nutshell, is to say, oh, if I could only be a child again in a world of gods and be safe. Now, I think Bamini's point was right on target. You know, one of the things I argue in Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism and other works is that the biggest fear of anti-Black racists and misanthropes, you know, all of the isms, the misogynists, all of them, is not whether we hate them. Because if in hating them, we're paying attention to them. It's whether they become irrelevant, the indifference you're talking about. And this is one of the fears of actually creating a better society, because in a society in which those maledictions disappear, it's not that there won't be individuals with those maledictions, it's just that they become irrelevant. This question then links into the question of power, which is what Richard was also talking about. There are a lot of people who attack power in a way. There are those who attack dignity, but they often don't really define power. They're often Hobbesian when they talk about power, and very reductive. They're really looking at just force in a very atomistic way. But if we understand power as the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so, then it means that we should bear in mind that it doesn't matter how many abilities we have, a lack of access to conditions means nothing happen. So power is ultimately the ability to make things happen and the access to the conditions. Of course, in unjust societies, in societies of degradation, etc., it's the privatization of the conditions. It's to make the conditions, and in this case, the broader conditions would be the social world and the institutions and the mechanisms through which we're able to have to make things happen in the world. And this is where the agency part comes in, because if we back up for a second, the problematic model looks at the self as a kind of thing, godlike thing that make things happen. But a relational metaphysical model, a communicative model, actually is trying to open up the mechanisms through which flourishing and other kinds of phenomena occur. And this means then one has to take seriously the extent to which the investment in the self can try to privatize that rather than opening it up. The examples I gave, you may notice I talked a lot about embodiments of dignity. And the embodiments, in phenomenological term, the body is a condition of possibility for there to be articulated a here through which one has relationships to there. If you took out the body, there's no here there. In fact, in your own work, Barnaby, you have analyses of body when you talk about the problems of mind and body analyses. Now, if we bring this around, what we begin to see is that more relational communicative models require us to open ourselves up to processes of vulnerability that are at the heart of communication. In a lot of my work, I actually argue that language, for instance, once it takes the form of communication, is fundamentally erotic because, in effect, it means language communication occurs in you and you in others. And there are people, the fear of intimacy and erotic life usually requires building the closed notion of the self to push others out there and begin to privatize power. There's more I could say, but I don't want to talk too long because I know we have a short time and perhaps one of the people in the audience would like to, or more than one of them would like to ask something. So thanks for the observations there. And yeah, I think we could take it from there.
I don't think at the moment anyone is putting up their hand in the audience, so we can continue until someone does, and I will be alert if someone does do that, and I will call on them.
Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the point about, so you could see the point I was making about radical love is also about the erotics of connectedness without suffocating others. It's to enable the facilitation of the social world to appear and for communicative practices to appear. And it also, has something in it which is rather striking, which is what the anti-humanists would hate this, but it's about facilitating our humanity to emerge. And our humanity emerges through a related word, humility. Because humility is also a function of not taking oneself so seriously that one will destroy the world. The other thing I'll just have to say very briefly is, one big problem we have right now, because what is hegemonic right now, what is dominating is the authoritarian personalities and structures. There are a lot of people who are losing the nuance to understand that in some struggles, there's not a good side and a bad side. Sometimes there are just two bad sides and many bad sides involved. If we look, for instance, I gave a talk where I pointed out that there are people who are thinking in a very naive way about a lot of contemporary conflicts. But if we take very seriously that there are certain models that are trying to push the whole world back into a kind of human childhood, right? Then it's ultimately, we're dealing right now of right wings fighting right wings, and that the rest of humanity is becoming collateral damage in that process. One thing as well, I'm very critical of what has been happening in a kind of false dilemma and straw man being constructed in certain kinds of arguments. There's a thing now, for instance, in some decolonial arguments that are presenting, say, notions of secularity as colonial. And this opens the door for theocrats to say they're anti-colonial and decolonial through pushing people into theocracies. Now, what's ignored in those kinds of arguments is that all the empires that emerged, whether they're Christian, Islamic, or even its tiny Asmonean Judaic form, were theocracies. So the idea of theocracy as the cure for colonialism is an absurdity. I think
Yeah.
someone had their hand up.
Yeah, someone does have a hand up. I've also been remiss. I should say that anyone who would like to make a comment, you do have to know this is being recorded for use as a podcast. So your voice and possibly your image will be recorded. And if on that basis you'd still like to contribute, we would welcome hearing from you. We do have someone. Are you still wanting to go ahead?
Can you hear me?
Yes, great, Graham Hayes. Yes, welcome, Graham. Thank
Hi,
you. Please make your comments. We have just a little time.
It was two inputs, really. The one was related to your comment about 90% of psychoanalysis being bullshit. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. The issue that I think is interesting about that is that I think even people on the psychoanalytic left or people with interest in a kind of psychoanalysis that can open up social and political conversations still seem to give too much credence for psychoanalytic theory. And there's a wonderful book, well, I thought it was wonderful, by Kelly Oliver on the colonization and psychoanalysis, where she says that we need to reinvent the terms and not assume that they are set in stone, set in concrete. As a way of opening up a conversation, which I think tonight has certainly demonstrated. So I think there's a way in which there's not a standard bearer of what psychoanalysis counts for or what the terms are. And by that, I'm not just talking about a kind of sloppiness and a lack of rigor, but there's a way in which the insertion of psychoanalytic concepts into the social world and vice versa can be reappropriated in a way that doesn't need the permission from the headquarters of the psychoanalytic institutes.
Yes.
The second point, which just struck me when we were talking about evil, and that is that I was reading an interview with Todd McGowan, who has sort of Lacanian leanings, which so do I, but he makes a really interesting point, I thought, about the link between excess and lack. As a way of explaining many things. And I just wondered how that fitted into a kind of addendum to a notion of evil that Lewis was talking about in terms of that one of the things that whether you're talking about individuals in relation to addictions, for example, or if you're talking about the billionaire class who just seem to be forever in the mode of excess, what's their socio-political lack, or in the case of political figures. That just struck me as an interesting insert to evil, unless I've misread something. Thank you.
No, I don't think you have, Graham. Those are two very interesting points. We have about 5 minutes. So, Lewis, it's up to you to address Graham's points, address everything else that's been raised this evening, and sum it up for us.
Well, Graham, I think you tapped into something that is crucial for the thesis that evil begins when we attempt to be full of ourselves, and that access point is there. Simone Weil talked about the need for decreation, right? Because if you become full of yourself, there's no room for others. You're so consumed that even time itself collapses. What's striking about, as you brought up the billionaire class, is there is profound misanthropy being manifested in that it creates a bubble of controlling all the conditions. And in fact, before we went into recording, we were having a wonderful conversation on the concept of idiocy. As we know in ancient Greece, an idiot was a private person, because the argument was that to be sufficient, to to be a political person is to be social and to come outside to relate to others. And the idea is if you're radically private, even though it started off in a negative word because the word "ed" goes all the way back to the meaning for the word deaf, and deaf people are not imbeciles, so it doesn't mean stupid in this sense, but it's saying that you're willfully making yourself immune to hearing others, which is part of what Richard was talking about in his presentation. And this then raises some rather interesting questions if we think back in terms of psychoanalysis. I actually I am not antipathetic to psychoanalysis, mainly because I look at psychoanalysis the way I look at any other practice or discipline. And that is because I wrote a book called Disciplinary Decadence, where I see a danger in any discipline or any methodology, right, as emerging when it takes itself too seriously, which is connecting our thesis. Because what happens is when disciplines ontologize themselves, when they cease to be self-critical, there's no room for others. There's no room to communicate. And in fact, it collapses into a form of disorder in which the discipline treats itself as reality instead of involved in participating with others and reality. Now, this is crucial because for me then, the elements in psychoanalysis that I think are on point is the observation of the concept of disguise, of masking, that there are elements of ourselves that may come to us in ways that are ultimately other than we think. Right? Even a dream of having a happy walk on a beach may seem like simply a positive thing, but of course, if interrogated further, its happiness might be masking something else. And this question of masking is something that has been not only in psychoanalysis, and again, so this is where I'm now taking it away from ontologizing psychoanalysis, but it's been a concern in not only many myths, there are all kinds of discussions of masking in many societies. But this question also of taking off the disguise is a fundamental aspect of many forms of theorizing, whether it's ideological critique, whether it's going to be in the different sciences. One starts with a premise of facing the uncertain, the unknown, and going through processes of those. The other thing is once one starts processes of letting go, it does raise, those processes raise a very difficult question with which to deal. And that difficult question is that liberation is never the end of a story. Liberation is always the beginning. You see, in my writings, I distinguish liberation from freedom. And freedom is the ongoing difficult practice of being, of negotiating lived reality. We're seeing this problem right now in society after society, and also political models after political models, even revolutionary ones, who think that even the language, the revolution, they treat it as if there can be a fait accompli. You can have a liberation, but a revolution is an ongoing praxis. And this is why in some societies that have claimed they're revolutionary, they make the mistake where if you visit them today, you could look all around and realize that they're locked in the moment of when they thought they achieved the revolution. They're locked in the past and have thus become conservative. So there's more than we could say, but I think there's a correlation that or at least a shared project of the practice of maturation, which has a form of letting go that will be crucial for all kinds of not only political praxis, but living therapeutic praxis that enables the reduction of dependency, but at the same time, the realization of shared lived reality. In other words, conviviality. How do we live together and grow together? And by extension, love.
That was beautiful and powerful. And I thank you.
Thank you. And
The
thanks.
the history of psychoanalysis in many ways has been a history of synecdoche, a history of a confusion between the container and the thing contained, and a mistaking of psychoanalysis with a vast superstructure of theoretical edifices that are largely speculative, and a loss of the liberatory core, the praxis. At least that's my view of it. This has been a wonderful evening, albeit all too brief, and with 1,001, or at least 101 threads that we could pursue. I would like to thank Bamini for her comments, Richard for his very powerful comments, which lead in all sorts of directions that I think psychoanalysts urgently need to entertain more seriously. I'd like to thank you, Graham, for coming in and for mentioning the Todd McGowan material. And then, of course, I'd like to thank you, Lewis, because this was just inspiring and provocative and should make all psychoanalysts think, as well as all humanists and existentialists, about the value of psychoanalysis read properly to the liberatory venture. If I can just change gear in the last minute, it is wonderfully apt that you talked about disguise and masks and unmasking, because the next podcast on the 30th of April actually is titled Unmasking, the protocols and the processes of unmasking. And we're doing something which I'm not aware of having been done before. We're having actors talk to psychoanalysts. And the question that the actors are being asked is, how do you get out of a role? You know, Richard and I saw an incredibly powerful play the last 2 weeks that he mentioned, Ithisi Sagunpundu. How do they get it out of the role at the end of their performance? And how relevant is this to psychoanalysts who very easily get stuck in their roles because of the powerful emotional forces that are at issue? So that's to be looked forward to for anyone in the audience. I hope you'll join us on April the 30th. I need to thank Nazia Smith, who is the power behind the technology of this podcast, of this webinar. And again, I'd like to thank everyone who spoke this evening for what was for me a very important occasion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.